Hello, truth seekers all over the world. This is Matthew Beavers from backtothecovenant.com. Hope you're having an amazing day wherever you're at in the world. So this is going to be part 4 of this video series I'm doing, talking about when a scriptural day begins. And the title of this one's going to be Digging Even Deeper. So if you come across this video and you haven't watched parts 1 through 3, I highly suggest you hit the stop button and go start at part 1, because the video series builds on top of the prior video. Something else I want to do in this video also is to challenge people watching this video and this series as a whole to entertain the idea that they might be wrong on this topic and be open to that. I was challenged on this topic, on when the day starts, on when between the evenings is, by a couple of gentlemen who I mentioned in part 1, and if I wasn't challenged by them, I might still be doing things the old way that I used to understand, and I wouldn't have done the deep studies that I would have into this topic and come to a different conclusion. So I challenge everybody that's watching this video, the series as a whole, to operate from a spirit of humility. And something that I need to correct myself, something I failed to mention in part 2 was just how important definitions are, because I've watched a lot of it. I read articles on both sides of the argument. I watched YouTube videos on both sides of the argument for sunrise and evening. And on the evening side, I did not see an abundance of people using definitions of words. They're just throwing verses at you and not really diving into Strong's and into Strong's definitions. So that's important as well. So studying this topic was an adventure, to say the least, for me. During my research, I did a ton of word studies. It was crazy how it came about too. I would be looking into the context of all these verses for one word in Hebrew, then in the process, I would find another phrase or Strong's number I knew I needed to review. Before I knew it, I was 3 or 4 word studies deep from the original one I was researching, and I stopped for a moment and paused and think to myself, what was I originally looking at? That's how in-depth this topic is. It's bigger than Genesis 1:5 and Nehemiah 13:19. At one point, it got so bad I had to break out a Post-it, which I love Post-its. My wife doesn't love them as much as I do. Sometimes they get on her nerves. So I had to get a Post-it out and write down all the words, phrases, and Strong's numbers that I knew I needed to go through to get somewhat organized. There was one word study that really made me a believer in a sunrise start to a day, and it seemed to bring a tidal wave of evidence from Scripture. And that was studying all the verses that had the phrase next day in them. So here are a few questions to ponder moving forward when thinking about the phrase next day in regards to Scripture. There are many times in Scripture you see next day after night is mentioned. Is next day ever mentioned after morning before evening occurs? When next day appears after the word night, is this an indication that when light appeared in the morning, it was a new day? Where in Scripture can you find the phrase next day after morning is mentioned, aka preceding evening or sunset? You cannot. If I'm wrong, somebody please prove me wrong and leave a scripture in the comments that shows otherwise, but I haven't found it. And I looked at every single verse that has the phrase next day in it. Maybe I missed one. Not perfect. This is very telling, especially since there are about 50 verses with next day in them, according to the number might be different if you're looking at different translations, but approximately 50 verses. Yes, for anyone paying attention, I did ask the same question twice. So with any of those 50 passages, can we clearly see any verses pointing to evening or sundown being the next day? Let's see. So let's look at evening, then the next day. We're going to start in the New Testament in Mark 11:11 and 12. And Yeshua went into Jerusalem and into the set-apart place, and having looked around on all, he went out to Beth-Anyah with the 12, as the hour was already late. So we're late in the day. And on the next day, when they had come out from Beth-Anyah, he was hungry. So here we have verse 11 showing that the hour was late, then next day is mentioned. Other translations render it as evening. So we're going to look at the LBP, which is translated from Aramaic. So if you ever have access to a translation in English that comes from the Aramaic, you definitely should check it out. Unless, hopefully, the translator did not slam their own theology in there, which does happen. I'm going to read this one as is. I'm going to quote it as is. I don't normally say the Messiah's name like this, because this is not his name. And this is Mark 11:11 in the LBP. And Jesus entered Jerusalem into the temple, and he saw everything. And when evening came, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So we have evening mentioned first, then the next day in the following verse. So let's go to Matthew 27:57. And when evening came, there came a rich man from Ramathayim named Joseph, who himself had also became a taught one of Yeshua. And 5 verses later in 62, on the next day, which was after the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate. Again, evening is mentioned first, then the next day later on. How is this evidence for a day beginning at evening or sunset? Why doesn't it just read, on the next evening, if it is understood that an evening starts a new day? Are we to assume that when it says on the next day, that it is referring to the next evening? Or is something else going on in these verses? So let's go all the way from Matthew to close to the beginning, not all the way. We're going to go to the Torah. We're going to go to Genesis 19:30 through 34 and look at poor old Lot and his daughters. Verse 30. And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come into us. We know what that means, that they're talking about intimate relations, procreation, as is the way of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine and lie with him, so that we preserve the seed of our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she arose. And it came to be on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, See, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight as well, and you go in and lie with him, so that we keep the seed of our father. Lot's daughters got him drunk and had relations with him at night. Then the next day came, and they discussed doing the same that night. Was the next day when the sun came up, since the transgression occurred at night? Looks that way in the context of the verses. The next day following the night. This makes sense with the pattern of the day and night seasons that I talked about in part 2. If a day started at evening, they wouldn't have to say, let us make him drink wine tonight. Saying that only makes sense in the daylight hours. So let's look at ruling over the people. Stay in the Torah and go to Exodus 18:13. And it came to be on the next day that Moshe sat to rightly rule the people, and the people stood before Moshe from morning until evening. On the next day, Moses was ruling over the people, and the people stood before him from morning to evening. Morning is mentioned first after next day, unlike in Genesis 1. And let me stop, since I didn't say this in the beginning. I'm going to provide, I think it's 22 to 23 proof text in this video, but I know there's some believers that's going to watch it and say, oh, these arguments are terrible, Matt. I'm not buying what you're selling on anything you presented. That's okay. I'm good with that. Just seek Abba's face and ask him to guide you by his Ruach, by his Spirit, and help you find his truth. All right, let's look at the morning watch. Let's go to 1 Samuel 11:9 to start. And they said to the messengers who came, Say this to the men of Yabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you shall have help. Then the messengers came and informed the men of Yabesh, and they rejoiced. The sun became hot during the new day season. And in verse 10 and 11, so the men of Yabesh, excuse me, I said it wrong. Yabesh, not Bosh, said, tomorrow we come out to you, and you shall do to us whatever seems good to you. That's never a good statement. And it came to be on the next day that Shaul put the people in 3 companies. And they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch, and smote Ammon until the heat of the day. And it came to be that those left were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. It was the next day during the morning watch, which is the last part of the night. And tomorrow was also mentioned. Tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, in verse 9. How about night precedes the next day? Let's go back to the Torah, Numbers 11:32. And the people were up all that day and all that night and all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who has least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. Day is mentioned first, then night, then after that the phrase next day. The verse doesn't say, and the people were up all that night, all that day, and all the next day. So the phrase next day is mentioned after night. Again, tomorrow a festival to Yahweh. Let's go to Exodus chapter 32, 5 and 6. And Aharon, or Aaron, saw and built an altar before it. And Aharon called out and said, tomorrow is a festival to Yahweh. And they rose early on the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So the word early in this verse is H7925, which is Shekam. And let me say this again before I read this Strong's number to you. I'm not one of those people that will just highlight and read a little bit of a Strong's number to prove my position. I will show you the whole thing. Primitive root probably to incline the shoulder to a burden, but used only as a diminutive from H7926. Literally to load up on the back of man or beast, that is to start early in the morning. Arise, be up, get oneself up, rise up early betimes morning. So if this definition is correct, they rose early to start in the morning on the next day. Looks like when Aharon said tomorrow is a festival to Yahweh, he was referring to morning, because the next verse says they rose early on the next day. Rising early on the next day doesn't make sense in regards to evening, because they will be rising to offer burnt offerings and peace offerings in the dark. So how about Moses, the night mountain climber? Go to Exodus 32, verse 1. And when the people saw that Moshe was so long in coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aharon and said to him, arise, make us mighty ones who go before us. For this Moshe, the man who brought us up out of the land of Mitzrayim, we do not know what has become of him. Moses is on the mountain getting instructions from our Yahweh. This is right before the golden calf incident occurs. So let's go down to verse 30 and 31. And it came to be on the next day that Moshe said to the people, you have sinned a great sin, and now I am going up to Yahweh, if I might atone for your sin. And Moshe returned to Yahweh and said, oh, these people have sinned a great sin, and have made for themselves a mighty one of gold. So according to verse 30, it is a new day. It says next day. In verse 31, Moshe returns to Yahweh up the mountain. If a day really begins at sundown or evening, that would have Moshe climbing a mountain in the dark. How does this make sense? What about night offerings? Let's go to 1 Chronicles 29, 21, and 22. And they made offerings to Yahweh and offered burnt offerings to Yahweh on the next day. 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, 1,000 lambs with their drink offerings and slaughterings in large numbers for all of Israel. And they ate and drank before Yahweh with great joy on that day. And they set up Shlomo, or Solomon, son of Dawid, to reign the second time, and anointed him before Yahweh to be leader, and Zadok to be priest. When did they normally start the offerings and burnt offerings? In the morning. Did they make all these offerings in the, what about morning dawned the next day. We're going to look at Jonah. I think this is the only verse in all of Jonah I'm going to read during this whole video series. Jonah 4, 6, and 7. And Yahweh Elohim appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah to be a shade for his head to deliver him from his discomfort. And Jonah greatly rejoiced over the plant. But as morning dawned the next day, Elohim appointed a worm which attacked the plant so that it withered. That's a very interesting worded verse. That's all I'll say about that one. What about healing in the dark? Question mark. So let's look at Luke 7, 11 to 16. And it came to be the next day, so it's the next day, that he went into a city called Naim. And many of his taught ones went with him, and a large crowd. And see, as he came near the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the master saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." And coming near, he touched the bier, and those bearing it stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And he gave him to his mother, and fear seized all. And they praised Elohim, saying, "A great prophet has been raised up among us, and Elohim has visited his people." Now let's jump down to 20 and 21, same chapter. And coming to him, the men said, "Yohanan," or John the Immerser, "has sent us to you, saying, Are you the coming one, or should we look for another?" And in the same hour he healed many of diseases and affliction and wicked spirits, and he gave sight to many blind ones. There is a question. Was Yeshua healing people with diseases at night in the dark? Or was he doing it in the daylight hours? Which one makes more sense? Now, I'm not putting limits on Elohim or putting limits on the son of Elohim. I'm just talking about the logistics of what's going on in the story. I never want to put limits on Elohim or his son. How about Yeshua descending a mountain at night? Just a couple of chapters later, same book, Luke 9:37. And it came to be on the next day, when they came down from the mountain, that a large crowd met him. Did Yeshua descend a mountain and meet this crowd in the dark? What about when he walked on the water? Let's go to John chapter 6, 16 through 22. And when evening came, so we see it's evening, his taught ones went down to the sea, and entering into the boat, they were going over the sea toward Kephar Nahum, and it had already become dark, and Yeshua had not yet come to them. And the sea was rising because a great wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 5 or 6 kilometers, they saw Yeshua walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were afraid. And he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." They wished therefore to take him into the boat. And at once the boat was at the land where they were going. On the next day, the crowd that was standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except that one into which his taught ones had entered, and that Yeshua had not entered the boat with his taught ones, but his taught ones went away alone. Evening is mentioned first, then we see that it was already dark, then later the phrase, "the next day" appears. Then it mentions the crowd was looking for Yeshua, and they saw there were no boats in the sea except his taught ones. How could they see this if it was dark after evening, dark at night? How could the taught ones see Yeshua walking on the water if it was pitch dark after evening? The only thing that makes sense in the context is all that this happened at or around sunrise or after sunrise. So how about some rooftop prayers? Let's go to Acts 10:9. And on the next day, as they were on their way approaching the city, Kepha, or Peter, went up on the house to pray about the 6th hour. So the 6th hour will be approximately noon in our modern Western time. So they were traveling a few hours after sunrise, and Peter went on the house to pray. I'm confident he didn't climb on the roof to pray in the dark, obviously, because it was noon. So what about a night vision? Let's go to Acts 16:9 through 11. And in the night, a vision appeared to Shaul, or Paul, a man of Macedonia, was standing, begging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us. And when he saw the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the master had called us to bring the good news to them. Therefore, sailing from Troas, he ran a straight course to Samothrace, hopefully I said that one right, and the next day came to Neapolis. A consistent pattern. Night is mentioned, then next day. It doesn't mention next day after morning or daylight hours, but nighttime. If I'm wrong on that statement, somebody please correct me, but I haven't seen it. How about brought him by night? Let's go to Acts 23, 31 and 32. So the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Shaul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day, they left the horsemen to go on with him and returned to the barracks. Night is mentioned first, then the phrase next day once again. If a day really starts at evening, wouldn't it make much more sense if the verses said, brought him by day? In verse 31, then on the next day, in verse 32. It would be easier to get back to their barracks during daylight hours. They didn't have cars with headlights back then. What about the evening and morning sacrifice? So when were the sacrifices done in Scripture? At what point in the day did they start? Below are a few scriptural texts that show the order of the continual offerings and a couple other verses with the phrase morning and evening. So the first one is just going to be a morning and evening verse. 1 Samuel 17:16. And for 40 days the Philistine drew near morning and evening and took his stand. Next is one about the sacrifice of burnt offerings and such in 1 Chronicles 16:39 through 40. And Zadok the priest and his brothers the priests before the dwelling place of Yahweh at the high place that was at Gibeon to offer burnt offerings to Yahweh on the altar of burnt offering regularly morning and evening, and to do according to all that is written in the Torah of Yahweh, which he commanded Yisrael. The temple sacrifices were always started in the morning. If I'm wrong, please correct me on that in the comments. Nowhere in Scripture are the burnt offerings or sacrifices worded as evening and morning. Does this fact prove a sunrise or evening start to the day? And other scriptural references you can find include 2 Corinthians, 2 Chronicles 2, 3, and 4, 2 Chronicles 31, 2 and 3, and Ezra 3, 2 and 3. How about Judges 19? Let's go to Judges 19, 4 and 5 to start. And his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he dwelt with him 3 days. And they ate and drank and spent the nights there. And it came to be on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to leave, but the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, refresh your heart with a piece of bread, and afterward go your way. The pattern of the day shows up in these verses 8 and 9. And he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to go, but the young woman's father said, please refresh your heart. So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And the man arose to go, he and his concubine and his servant. But his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, see, the day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night, so the day is coming to an end. Stay here and let your heart be glad, and you shall rise early tomorrow for your journey, and you shall go to your tent. And you shall rise early tomorrow. How can you rise early at evening? You don't find the words rise early at night anywhere in Scripture. So what about 1 Samuel 19? Shaul sought to smite the spear through Dawid and into the wall, but he slipped away from the presence of Shaul. So he smote the spear into the wall, and Dawid fled and escaped that night. And Shaul sent messengers to Dawid's house to watch him and to put him to death in the morning. Michal, Dawid's wife, informed him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you are put to death. How does the phrase, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you are put to death, fit into the context of an evening start to a day? Evening does not come after night. Morning does. What about a 3 days plague? Not a 3 days journey, but a 3 days plague. 2 Samuel 24, 13 and 15. 13 through 15. God then came to Dawid and informed him and said to him, Should 7 years of scarcity of food come to you in your land, or would you flee 3 months before your enemies, while they pursue you? Or should there be 3 days plague in your land? Now know and see what answer I take back to him who sent me. And Dawid said to God, I am in great trouble. Please let us fall into the hand of Yahweh, for his compassion is great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. And Yahweh sent a plague upon Israel from morning till the appointed time, and from dawn to Beersheba 70,000 men of the people died. The 3 days plague was started when? In the morning. Why didn't it start at evening? So what about John 20? John 20 verse 1 is a huge proof text for an evening start to a day. But actually, there's proof in the chapter, later in the chapter, that disproves evening. I'm going to show you that here. So John 20 verse 1, and on the first day of the week, so we see the first day of the week, obviously, Miriam, or Mary, from Magdala, came early to the tomb while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. This is a go-to verse for believers that start a day at evening, because the verse says still dark, which if you look at the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, none of them say that. Further examination of the context proves otherwise. Let's skip down to verse 19. When therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut where the taught ones met, for fear of the Yehudim or Jews, Yeshua came and stood in the midst and said to them, peace to you. Let me read that first part of that verse again. When therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week. So how can it be evening on the first day of the week in verse 19 if evening already occurred and it was the first day of the week in verse 1? This is further proof a day starts at sunrise, from my perspective. Now, if verse 19 said, therefore it was evening on that day, the second day of the week, then an evening start to a day would make more sense here in the context, but that's not what it says. What about set yourselves apart tomorrow? We're going to go to Joshua. I think it's the first time I visited Joshua in this study. Starting in Joshua 7 verse 6. And Yehoshua, or Joshua, tore his garments and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of Yahweh until evening. Both he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. In verse 13 and 14 it reads, rise up, set the people apart, and you shall say, set yourselves apart for tomorrow. Because thus said Yahweh Elohim of Israel, that which is under the ban is in your midst. O Yisrael, you are not able to stand before your enemies until you put away that which is under the ban out of your midst. And you shall be brought near in the morning, according to your tribes. And it shall be the tribe which Yahweh takes comes according to the clans, and the clan which Yahweh takes comes by households. And the household which Yahweh takes comes by men. It was already evening. Then Yah said, set yourselves apart tomorrow. Joshua went before the ark until it was evening. Later on, Yahweh instructs him to rise up and set themselves apart tomorrow. Then morning is mentioned. Never in scripture do you see tomorrow mentioned after morning. Only the reverse order. Fact check me on that. If I'm wrong and something has slipped through the cracks and I haven't seen it, please bring it to my attention. I want to be righteous. Correct me in the comments. How about arrested at evening? Acts 4:3. One quick verse, quick hitter. And they arrested them and put them in jail until the next day, for it was already evening. It was already evening, and they were put in jail until the next day. One conclusion makes sense in the context of this verse, and it's not sunset. So what about the last evening? So I'm going to read this verse in the ISR first, and then the King James second, because it reads a little different. Good old King Jimmy. Genesis 31:29 in the ISR. It is in the power of my hand to do evil to you. But the Elohim of your father spoke to me last night, saying, guard yourself that you do not speak to Jacob either good or evil. In the same verse, in the KJV, it is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the Elohim, I'm going to clean it up, of your fathers spake unto me yesternight. So it's last night in the ISR, and it's yesternight in the King James, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or evil. The phrase last night only appears 5 times in all of Scripture that I found. But one phrase you won't find is last evening or yester evening. For the King James Version, folks out there. Why is that? If a day really begins at evening, you would think you would find a phrase like that somewhere in Scripture to describe the prior day. So I've hit you with quite a few examples and verses in this video, and I could have put a ton more, but I didn't want to make this video super long. I know some people just check out mentally after after so long, so I have to keep that in mind. So this concludes part 4, and then part 5 I'm going to discuss some of the most common proof texts for an evening start to a day, and I'm very familiar with most of them because I used to use them. And now I see that from a different perspective. And then I found a couple in my research on this topic that I wasn't familiar with that were interesting, so I'm going to include them as well. So I hope this video was a blessing to you. If it was, leave a comment, like it, share it, and like I always like to end, get your scriptural shovel out and keep digging into the Most High's word. Shalom.